This actually might be the perfect hockey video game. Even though it came out in 1991, NHL Hockey and the Sega Genesis feels like a game that was made much more recently. The physics engine in this game just feels right. You've got everything here from penalties to fights. And it's incredibly satisfying to play this game. And I've really got to emphasize the fact that this game came out way back in August 1991. It feels almost like ancient history when it comes to the timing of video games. We're talking like, what, 35 years ago? And yet people are still talking about this game today. So let's go take a close look and see if we can figure out why. By 1991, there had already been a number of hockey video games. Some of these games were actually pretty good. Some of them maybe weren't quite as good. And some of them are so bad that they're legendary. However, even the best games had major flaws. For example, most 8-bit hockey games expected you to be able to control your goalie at the same time as one of your defensemen. And that's a lot easier said than done. Now, if you haven't played some of these really old hockey games, I really don't blame you, right? Some of them are not really that good. But I do want to give you at least a quick rundown of these games for the purpose of comparison. But don't worry, we're going to have longer videos that go deep into these games in the future. So most of us old guys remember playing ice hockey on the NES, which came out back in early 1988. The teams are really just different jersey colors, and the real strategy is in deciding what size players you want your team to use. The big players are slower, the little players are faster, and it really does make a difference. All in all though, this is a pretty easy arcade style game once you get used to how it plays. It's a ton of fun to play this game, and it's probably honestly the deepest of the 8-bit hockey games in retrospect, because you can choose like the big players, the medium players, or the really small ones. But it's still nothing compared to what EA came out with just 3 years later. Blades of Steel was another 1988 game and was really, really popular back then. I can't say that it held up all that well over the years, however. The coolest part is the fighting mechanic, of course. Now, if you win the fight, your guy gets the puck and stays on the ice, and the loser ends up getting a penalty. It's pretty repetitive though, and it's pretty easy after a while. Now, Blades of Steel was hugely popular in 1988 and 1989. I can't stress that enough. I mean, everybody was talking about it, right? But it was kind of one of those easy come, easy go type video games. I honestly don't see any real reason to play it these days unless you're kind of crazy like me, right? Ice hockey on the NES has smoother animation, it has smoother graphics, it has better play control, and it's got more replay value overall. And then you've got Wayne Gretzky Hockey on the NES, which is one of the worst games of all time. This is based on the computer game of the same name, which you would think would make this good, but just look at it. This game is a complete disaster. You have to push the select button to change the guy you control, and sometimes that doesn't even work. At one point, my guy got stuck on an opponent and I couldn't change control to anybody else. Then the AI skated around in circles until the period was over. This very well might be the worst hockey game of all time. So people get really upset with me for dumping on really bad games that LJN made for the NES, and there's one favorite viewer of mine who's going to comment as soon as I mention a certain game, so I won't talk about that one. But I will talk about that awful NFL game that LJN made for the NES, which really is bad. But honestly, this THQ game, Wayne Gretzky Hockey, is up there. This game is so bad that like it's giving NFL a real run for the money. And then you've got Slapshot in the old Sega Master System, which is kind of a pain. The puck like teleports when you pass it, which is something. This is mostly a Blades of Steel clone, except with worse graphics, worse sound, and worse play control. And that was another game that came out in 1990. I mean, I feel like hockey games were actually getting worse as time went on. And that's one of the reasons why NHL Hockey on the Sega Genesis really stands out. So let's go take a look and see how this game came to be. So the idea started with this man, Trip Hawkins. Now Hawkins was a fan of the old Stratomatic board games and wanted to make a computer football game that would feel as realistic as Stratomatic. It took years to put together, but the result was John Madden Football on the Apple II with this unforgettable intro. The game itself, however, was a lot more forgettable. Now, there are people who swear to me that John Madden Football on the Apple II is a lot of fun. Personally, I find it extremely slow and really boring. It's one of those games where I guess you just had to be there at the time, something like that. Meanwhile, Sega Master System was struggling in the face of the competition from the Nintendo Entertainment System. While the Master System theoretically could compete with the NES in terms of hardware, its software library was lacking. As I mentioned before, Slapshot for the Master System looks, sounds, and plays bad. It might not look so bad if you don't compare it to any other hockey game that was out by 1990. But just one look at ice hockey on the NES and you'll notice how much worse the Master System experience really was. Now, in my opinion, the real problem with the Sega Master System is that it just didn't have good enough games, at least not in North America. Now, there were some pretty good Sega Master System games in Japan under the various names that the system went by, but Sega decided to work closely with the toy company Tonka in North America, and Tonka didn't want a whole bunch of these games to come out here for some stupid reason or other. I don't understand it. Anyway, by the time the Genesis came out in North America in late summer 1989, Sega knew that it was in trouble and that it needed a different approach. Now, Sega's strategy was to focus on sports games, in particular on sports games that received celebrity endorsements. This is why you see names like Tommy Lasorda, Arnold Palmer, Pat Riley, and Buster Douglas in the early Sega sports titles. And of course, there was Joe Montana, who signed a multi-million-dollar contract with Sega to endorse their flagship football game. Meanwhile, Trip Hawkins managed to convince Electronic Arts to release a version of its Madden game for the Sega Genesis. The result was the first John Madden Football, which came out right in time for Christmas 1990 and which was a huge success. Now, most of you guys know that I've got a football channel already. I did a video on there about the original John Madden football game and the original Joe Montana football game on the Genesis, so I've gone into a lot of detail on the drama there if you want to figure some of that stuff out. But the long story short version here is that Sega's contractor ran out of time to make Joe Montana football, and so the head honchos over at Sega went over to beg EA to help them finish their game. This is why the first Joe Montana game plays a lot like the first Madden game. They're the same game. It's just that Joe Montana is missing some features. Anyway, all of the success that EA had paved their way to make a whole bunch of different sports games for the Genesis. For example, EA had a somewhat popular game called PGA Tour Golf that came out for the MS-DOS back in early 1990. This isn't exactly Lynx 386, but it still isn't a bad game for its time. Anyway, in early 1991, EA came out with the Genesis version of the game, which I guess was popular enough. So I'm not going to comment on the golf game. I'm not really a fan of golf games. If you are, you can play it. Let me know what you think. Anyway, all of this was popular enough to allow EA the space to start working on a hockey game sometime in 1991. And so when it came out in August 1991, NHL Hockey on the Sega Genesis was the first Genesis hockey game. It's a little bit older than Mario Lemieux Hockey, which came out like a couple months later. I think that this was also the first 16-bit hockey game, though there may have been one on the TurboGrafx that came out before. You guys can figure that out and let me know. Anyway, NHL Hockey was really amazing too. The first thing you'll notice is the vertical perspective, which is a lot different than the older hockey games. All of the older games had this horizontal perspective. Now the vertical perspective feels a little bit more like the Madden series. But it's important because it allows you to see up the ice, and it also allows you to see what the other team is doing. Now, that horizontal perspective does make sense. After all, it mirrors what you would see if you would watch the sport on television. But as you know, there's a pretty big difference between watching the sport on TV and actually trying to play it yourself. Now, in my opinion, the perspective here actually really is a key. So you see, the old NHL Hockey series really was designed to be as user-friendly as possible to you when you play the game. Right? Everything in the game feels smooth, including the way that you control the speed of the players as they go up and down the ice, and everything looks really smooth because it's so easy to see what's happening in front of you and what's happening behind you and what's happening to the side because of the perspective. If it were another horizontal game, it would be a little bit harder to tell, whether somebody's on top of you, if they're coming close to you, and all this other stuff, right? Like, the best part about this game, though, is really the controls, because it doesn't feel like you're fighting against your own controls the way that a lot of the 8-bit hockey games feel. Now, if you read the manual, you might get lost in the explanations of how this game works, but it's actually pretty simple. The C button generally takes different types of shots depending on how long you hold it down, and it's also the button you push to hit the other team when you're in defense. The B button either passes or changes the guy you control depending on the situation. It's basically the choose another player button. And then A is used for line changes, for dumping the puck in, and so on. But really, the easiest way to learn how to play this game is literally just to play the game. It feels really, really natural, and it is the sort of game that you can learn how to play after like a minute or two right after you pick up the controller. Now, most Sega Genesis sports games were like that. The controls were intuitive and were really, really easy to learn for a beginner. The coolest part of this game, though, is that it really feels like a real hockey game. While you don't have the player names, you really won't notice it. You can set it up so you have to change your lines, or you can make it so that all the fatigue settings are turned off. If you've got the penalties turned on, the game will call penalties when they take place. And there are the fights too. Yeah, there are fights in this game, which can really surprise you, especially if you're not ready for them. I'm not sure what triggers it, but you can see fights every now and then. After a fight, both players serve 5-minute penalties. That means that fighting in this game is not as important to strategy as it is in other games. So for example, in Blades of Steel, one of your best offensive weapons is to punch out the other players in a fight to give yourself a one-on-one. Slapshot is the same way. You want to fight to get the other player out of your way. In NHL Hockey, fighting is a sort of an added-on part of the game, and it really isn't a core gameplay mechanic. And that's something that they took out after the first two games. So the story here is that, the NHL in the early 1990s was kind of as stuffy as it is today when it comes to stuff like this. The league really didn't like all of this fighting, and it was particularly horrified when journalists playing the first NHL hockey game found it easy to get like Wayne Gretzky to get into fights, when they were messing around with it. And so eventually the NHL required EA to take the fighting out of the game in order to keep the NHL license, but that's a longer story for another day. Anyway, the original NHL hockey game on the Genesis is simply amazing. This is an all-time classic. My only complaint is that there's no season mode. You have to use a password to continue if you're playing a playoff series. But really, that's the only complaint about this game that I have. And the truth is that most of these EA Sports games on the Genesis in the old days didn't have battery backup at all. It's not just this game that had this problem. For hockey, it's not really until NHL 95 that you see a full season mode. And for American football, it's the same thing as Madden 95 where that mode started to come along. Anyway, that itself is another story for another video, so we'll hold off on that for the time being. But overall, this game was really revolutionary, and this game really took the video game world by storm back in late 1991. If you lived in Canada in 1991, this was the game to get, or as this Toronto Star article says, it was video game hockey to perfection. The Video Cowboy over in Kingston, Ontario had this the number 2 game on the platform right behind Sonic the Hedgehog, and one look at that guy's face will tell you that he really meant business. But you know, it wasn't just the Canadian newspapers that loved this game. NHL Hockey received a ton of praise from every single video game magazine that was around at the time when it came out. Larry Flint's Video Games and Computer Entertainment gave this game a fantastic score back in October 1991. This is a really good score even though it's not perfect. The only complaint was that the computer was too easy, which makes me suspect that the reviewer was playing as the Los Angeles Kings the whole time. The reviewers over at the All Sega magazine Mega Play gave it all 8s, which put it up in the same category as Streets of Rage and Sonic the Hedgehog, and notice that nobody has anything negative to say. And Electronic Gaming Monthly was full of similar praise for this game. Once again, there aren't any really negative aspects to these reviews. The most fun review, however, is probably this one from the September 1991 issue of GamePro. GamePro noted in particular the game's totally excellent fighting mode, which probably made the NHL really mad. This is before GamePro learned that you can do numerical reviews, so I'm guessing that these mean that they liked it. Anyway, like I said, overall this game was really revolutionary, and it went worldwide in 1992, though that was because of a bunch of the rights issues. It wasn't until November 1992 that the Japanese version was released, and it was simply titled EA Hockey. It's the same game, except you choose from a bunch of different countries instead of different NHL teams. They still have the players modeled after real-life players, which means you can just choose Canada and win. And surprisingly, everything is still in this version, including all the fights. Now, I would have expected that they would take out the fighting for the international version of the game. You would think it's natural because you don't see that many fist fights when you're watching like Olympic hockey or whatever, but I mean, whatever, oh well. It still is a ton of fun to play this version, and it's kind of challenging too because you don't necessarily know who a lot of these guys are. Anyway, if you're a collector, it's actually not that hard to find the Japanese and European versions of this game. Hockey wasn't exactly a hugely popular sport in Japan in the early 1990s, but this game was still a hit over there. Weekly Famitsu notes that it was released the same day as Pro Football, which is John Madden Football, and the reviewers gave the two games pretty much the same ratings. Now, honestly, I wonder if the people over at Famitsu ever actually played these games, because NHL Hockey is so much better than the original John Madden Football that it's not even funny. In fact, I can prove it to you. I'll show you. So the problem with the original John Madden Football is that it's way too slow. It takes a long time to get from one play to the next, and you spend a bunch of time waiting for the players to run on and off the field. NHL Hockey is fast, and the action really never lets up. It's not so fast that you can't see what's happening, but the action is non-stop and continuous with very few pauses. Anyway, maybe it's just me, but I would have guessed that most people who are playing both of these games and who are legitimately playing them would have preferred the one that gives you like continuous action and that is fast and that doesn't take an hour to play a single game, you know what I'm saying? But I mean, who knows? This is Japan after all. Anyway, if you really can't decide, you can always go for the EA Sports Doubleheader, which was a UK-only release back in 1992. This game gives you the best of both worlds. I would argue that you can tell the hockey game was better just by looking at the back cover art, but maybe that's just me. Anyway, I guess we all have our own opinions, but the truth is that the original NHL Hockey on the Sega Genesis was just an absolutely fantastic game. I mean, we're talking about a game that was totally revolutionary in the gameplay design, in the graphics, and the level of detail, and the physics engine. Now, I don't think that we could call this version of it the best hockey game of all time, but the only reason why is because the sequels to this game improved on it, right? But we'll have a little bit more on those in a later video, and I'll talk with you guys a little bit later.